This video is for all of you wannabe Hoya heads out there. And I have talked about Hoyas before, I guess fairly recently. I think in October, November time, I did a full Hoya tour sharing with you every single Hoya I had in my collection, as well as ranking them from worst to best. But none of them are really worst because I actually quite like all of the Hoyas that I have. Some are just like extra special to me and have a special place in my heart, and so like I'm able to rank them higher. But I love all of them. So if you want to see all the different sort of types I have, which I've got, I think like 32 different varieties. I know it's kind of a lot. Go watch that. I will link that down below in the description as well as in the clickable eye up there if you want to go watch that. But this video today is all about how I care for my Hoyas, how I keep them happy and healthy and thriving and blooming, and sort of my general experience with them. I've had Hoyas in my collection for I think four or 5 years now, and I've learned a lot in that time, and I want to share that experience with you in today's Hoya care video. We're standing here today because this is where I do keep a lot of the Hoyas in my home. A lot of the Hoyas I have are very happy and content on this shelf, and so like I thought it made a nice background. And I also have some Hoyas that I can like pick up and hold and show y'all as well. But before we get into it, I want to say if you're new here and you don't know me already, hi, my name is Emma and I make houseplanty content all over the internet. So if you want to follow along with my houseplanty journey and maybe learn something along the way, stick around, watch some more of my videos, and subscribe to my channel. If you are not new here, welcome back. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoy this video. This video is actually picked out by my patrons. I asked them which sort of plants they wanted to see a care video on, and they picked Hoyas. And so this one's for all of them and all of you who want to get better at growing these beautiful creatures. If you're picking up a Hoya in a store, it is probably being labeled as a wax plant because of these sort of shiny, waxy, sort of typically kind of thick leaves. So they're called wax plants, but not all of them have sort of waxy leaves. I've got this one here and a few others that actually have sort of furry leaves, and there's some that are a little bit more matte and less shiny as well. There's loads of different types of Hoya. I think I said 600 or 700 different types. There could even be more, and people are hybridizing them as well. So I think it's kind of an infinite thing. You can grow so many different types of Hoyas, and I feel like that is something that makes them quite fun because they are all quite unique and different. I typically find them fairly easy growing as well and low maintenance in my home. I don't have to worry about my Hoyas all that much. That's why I have them in this room in the office. I don't have access to this room every day because Joe uses it to work. And so I'm okay leaving these plants in this zone knowing that they might miss out on water for an extra 1 or 2 days and they won't get really mad at me for it. So they tend to be some of the hardiest plants in my collection, but I've also found that they are fairly slow growing, especially if you're growing them from small plants or propagations. It's really easy to amass a lot of them because they are fairly like small footprint. Their leaves don't get massive. I mean, there's some varieties with really huge leaves, but for the most part, they tend to be on the smaller side. That being said, you can grow them very big and bushy, but it does take quite a while to get to that point. I think there's a phrase that first they sleep, then they creep, then they leap. And so it takes years from the plant joining your collection or being propagated to actually get to the point where it's growing quite fast. And I've experienced that firsthand with a lot of them. My Hoya ovovata, I've spoken about it a lot. The first year I had it, it didn't do anything. The second year, it like started a little bit, did the creeping phase, and then in 2024, this one just leapt and started growing leaf after leaf after leaf. And so it does take a little while for them to kind of get to that point where they are growing quite steadily. So I mean, maybe in a few years' time, all of us Hoya heads who've amassed so many tiny little plants will just have huge entire jungles that we don't know what to do with because all of our Hoyas are in the leaping phase and are growing quite rapidly. But for now, a lot of the ones I have in my collection are fairly small and are a little bit more on the slow side of growing. So the ideal light I've found for my Hoyas has been bright indirect light, and I've pretty much given it to this shelf here. They're all underneath this grow light, which is on for like 12-15 hours a day, especially in wintertime. This spot does not get any sort of light from the environment. I know I am right up next to a window here, but unfortunately it's not sort of bright enough to give it the sort of light that they might want, and so I need to have the grow light on them in order to give them the light they deserve. They quite like that bright indirect light. Too much light can scorch their leaves, so I'm talking like long hours of prolonged hot sun can scorch their leaves, but I honestly haven't found that to be a problem. I actually have a couple that live in my bedroom window, which is a southwest facing one. This one is one of them. And they get literally as much possible natural light as possible in my flat in the UK. So it isn't all that sunny, but when it is sunny, they do get prolonged hours of direct sunlight. And I haven't found it to be a problem for the ones that I have in that window. The sort of thicker leafed Hoyas tend to be more hardy and able to have that much light. If I put something that was a very thin leafed thing up there, it can cause problems and cause them to burn, but ones like this one tend to not have issues, and I think actually really like being in such bright light. This one is a Hoya rosita, and it's actually called that because when it gets prolonged hours of sunlight, it goes pink, it goes all rosy, and that is pretty normal for Hoyas. It's actually a sort of defense mechanism, and it's not really a problem, I'd say. It's kind of like how humans tan when they get prolonged hours of sunlight. Hoyas, they go a more pinky color in order to protect themselves from prolonged hours of sun, and like I said, it doesn't cause this one any issues. I've not had any issues with it burning. It is right up in that window, and it's never once complained about it. In fact, it's grown very, very well for me, and it also flowered quite prolifically. I'll get to talking about flowers later on, but I think having the higher light definitely helped this one out in the flowering department. And even something like a grow light here can sun stress the leaves. So this one, it's a more splashy Hoya, but you can see the sort of splashes have gone a slightly pinky hue. On other leaves, they're more of a white light green, but the one closest to the light up there has gone a bit pinkier, and that is completely normal and fine. I would not worry about it, and I think it's actually kind of cute in some cases. And some of the lighter varieties, they can go like purple in their leaves as well, which is fun. They can also tolerate slightly lower light. I'm sure some of these would be perfectly fine in a spot that's not getting as many hours of grow light, or are like closer to a window but not getting tons of light, like not up in it, but like back here. I feel like this one is a good example of that. My Hoya polynura. It's about 1.5 meters pulled back from the window, and it is doing absolutely fine there. It's got enough light to grow, and actually I wouldn't want to give it too much more because it would kind of bleach the leaves, meaning that they get a bit lighter green, whereas I want them to stay this sort of beautiful dark green color that they are now. I should also say that variegated Hoyas like this one here, the Hoya australis lisa, where they have a bit more white in the middle, will prefer higher light. It will allow them to grow better and stronger and bigger leaves because the white bits of the leaves don't have the chlorophyll in it, which will help them photosynthesize. So they're gonna prefer higher light to ones that have sort of solid green leaves, or even the sort of splashy variegation like that. The splashy stuff doesn't really count as white for some reason. I'm not 100% sure why, but it's ones like this that do require slightly more light and will be much happier in a brighter environment. I like to let my Hoyas dry out pretty much completely between waterings, and to be honest, I probably err on the side of underwatering them and letting them sit dry for probably slightly a little bit too long, but they don't seem to mind it that much, and they would much prefer underwatering to overwatering because their roots really need air. So they are semi-epiphytes, meaning that they can grow on trees like soillessly, or they can grow in soil, and so they like to have quite a lot of air around their roots. And if you're like flooding it with water when you're watering and watering too frequently, not giving the roots enough chance to breathe, then it can cause root rot and cause your plant to die. I feel like overwatering is one of the leading causes of plant death in Hoyas. You do really want to make sure that they dry out pretty much completely between waterings, in my experience. They have tolerated just fine with my slightly more erratic watering schedule, and of course it does depend on your environment. You can't really water them on a time-based system. Like, you can't say, oh, once a week or once every 14 days I'm going to water my Hoyas, because it's going to depend on the size of the pot and the environment you're in and the time of year. And so I much prefer to go off a soil dryness based system, and I usually honestly see it with my eyes whether or not the soil is dry. I have actually just watered this entire room, and so they are quite moist at the minute, which is good. They can also tell you they're thirsty by going a little bit limper. I think it's called the taco test, where your Hoya leaves aren't supposed to bend up into a taco shape. They're supposed to stay quite firm, but when they're thirsty and not holding as much water in their leaves, they'll be able to taco up. Obviously, be careful doing this. You don't want to like snap the leaf in half, because you can very easily do that, but you can feel in the Hoyas, especially these sort of like medium thickness leaf ones, that they are thirsty based off of their sort of rigidity. Hoyas definitely like a bit of warmth, but they should be fine in your sort of normal home conditions. I think their ideal range is between 16 and 24 degrees Celsius, or 61 to 75 Fahrenheit. Pretty much your average home temperatures. If you're comfortable in your home, they'll be comfortable. Some of the more hardy varieties can tolerate a little bit lower in temperatures, like the really thick-leafed ones like the Carrii and the Obovata, sort of the lacunosas. Those can tolerate a little bit colder temperatures and more dips because they are just slightly hardier. But in general, I wouldn't let the temperature drop below maybe 10 degrees Celsius or 50 Fahrenheit, because that can cause cold damage on them and could be an issue. So if you are ordering Hoyas online, which I find is the best way to get sort of uncommon Hoyas, try to avoid ordering them in the winter time when temperatures are quite cold outside. When they get below 10 at night, you don't want to be leaving them outside in any capacity, especially if they're being shipped. So it's better to keep them on the warmer side than the cooler side, but your home should be all right for them. If you're comfortable, they should be comfortable. They do, however, prefer higher humidity, and again, the sort of thicker leaved ones can be more tolerant than the thinner leaved ones, but most like it around 60% humidity. I highly suggest, if you don't have a hygrometer thermometer in your home, to get one, because they are super duper useful. I can tell right now that it is 56% humidity, 58% humidity in here, and that is, I mean, ever so slightly low for them, but they are fairly tolerant. Again, the ones I have in this space are the most tolerant ones I have. If you've got more like thinner leafed varieties, like the New Guinea Ghost, that one is going to prefer slightly higher humidity. So that's one I keep in my Millsbow cabinet, where it is usually like 70% or higher, because that's what they prefer. And again, the sort of thicker leafed ones are going to be generally more tolerant because they are more hardy. I personally fertilize my Hoyas with nearly every water. I do that with pretty much all of the plants in my collection, just because that's how I do it. But I am using a houseplant focused fertilizer, and it is, I think, fairly diluted, and so they're getting like little and often fertilizer. I've also heard slow release fertilizer works well for Hoyas, but I've personally not used it. They seem to be perfectly happy with that sort of fertilizing system. Again, when they are quite small and not necessarily in that sort of fast growing phase, you can probably cut down your fertilizing to maybe every other water or like once a month, but I don't think it is too big of an issue with them, especially if you're using houseplant focused fertilizer. If you're using a more all-purpose fertilizer, I would highly recommend maybe cutting that down to half strength, diluting it even more, because they can be a little bit too intense and can burn your plant's roots. But like I said, houseplant fertilizer should be fine. I have also heard that fertilizers higher in phosphorus can help your Hoyas bloom a little bit more. And also some people recommend using something like orchid mist or a foliar fertilizer spray on them to encourage blooms as well. I have some of that. I've tried it a couple times, but not enough to say whether or not it is successful. I just let my Hoyas do their thing and don't worry about fertilizer too much, and they seem to be growing very, very well regardless. I find the right soil is very, very, very important for your Hoyas. They like something super duper chunky and airy. They like to have air around their roots in order to thrive. And so I keep all of mine in Anthurium and orchid soil from Soil Ninja. It is a really chunky, barky mix, lots of air pockets, and my Hoyas seem to absolutely love that. But if you have sort of base mix, normal houseplant soil, I would highly recommend putting orchid bark in just to aerate it some more and like give the roots gaps that they need, because their semi-epiphytic nature will allow them to grow better if they have that sort of space. And I've also found that they prefer to be a little bit more root bound. You can tell I don't necessarily have huge pots for my Hoyas. Even the sort of bigger ones are in fairly like not massive pots in my opinion, and I found that's because they prefer to be a little bit more root bound. If you give them too big of pots, they'll spend all of their time creating a root system and filling out that pot and less time on the foliage, which is what I want out of my Hoyas. So keeping them a little bit more root bound is their preference in my experience. I have also heard some people absolutely rave about keeping their Hoyas in semi-hydro substrate with a sort of water reservoir or in a self-watering pot. I've personally not found that to be great for my Hoyas, in my home at least. So I do have a single Hoya in semi-hydro, just in there, my Hoya australis. It's growing fine in here. It's not growing poorly. I find that I like soil for them better for some reason. In my home at least, I tend to put this more like water craving plants in semi-hydro and in a water reservoir system because they like to have that moisture more often. But because Hoyas tend to like to dry out a little bit more, it just hasn't like gelled with me in my collection personally. So totally fine if you want to grow them in semi-hydro. Loads of people very highly recommend it and say that's the best thing that's ever happened to their Hoyas. That's just not personally been my experience, and so like just use soil. For these ones, just use soil. I just find it so much easier to work with them and make sure that they are getting the right amount of water and air and like time to grow. I mean, that being said, this one's absolutely fine, but I basically ignore this one. Another very important thing for Hoyas is support. A lot of the varieties will absolutely love having some sort of support in here. You can see I have this one on a sort of round trellis that I've wound it around about 1 billion times. I don't think I can get the trellis off at this point because it is such a tangled mess in here, but they will love that sort of support. In nature, they naturally grow climbing up around trees, and so they sort of like want something to mimic that in a sort of home environment, and so a trellis works really, really well for them. They don't, however, need something like a moss pole. They do kind of have sort of aerial root looking things, but they're not the type of variety, they're not like an aroid, which if you're putting it onto a moss pole, the roots will grow into the pole and it can help them size up. That won't be the case for your Hoyas. Their leaves will stay the same size. They might not even root into the pole. They don't need the moisture from the pole like a lot of aroids do. They just want something to climb. So having a trellis is a really good option. You can also like get some wire and have them grow out that. This one here, my Hoya obovata, is actually climbing up the pole of these shelves. And it is very important to note that they grow anti-clockwise around things. I don't know why that is the case, but they always will prefer to go anti-clockwise. So if you are wrapping them on a trellis, it is highly recommended to go anti-clockwise to keep up with the sort of natural growth pattern of them. It is also quite common for them to produce these sort of long runner things without leaves when they're looking for something to climb. This one has a trellis on it, but in order for it to get to the trellis, it would need to go down again, which is not its sort of natural growth pattern. And so if I want it to go down to this trellis, I need to like push it down manually. That is absolutely fine. It's not going to have a problem with that, but in an ideal world, they would constantly grow upwards. That's not really possible in a sort of home situation, so trellises are a really good option. But that being said, not all of them want to or need to climb. They can also grow hanging. A lot of varieties are perfectly fine with that. Things like the Hoya linearis there pretty much won't climb. They just want to hang down. And I have recently gotten the question about how I decide whether they grow hanging or on a trellis. And it's kind of a bit of intuition. I don't really know how I've made this distinction, but I think in general, rule of thumb is smaller leaves, thinner stems tend to like to hang, thicker leaves, thicker stems. Stems can even get woody almost, will prefer to grow on something like a trellis. But you can grow them just downwards. They might not like it though. Like my ovata was growing downwards, it decided it wanted to climb along this pole instead, and it made that decision for itself. So I couldn't let that one trail down even if I wanted it to, because it just chose a different life for itself. Propagating Hoyas is very, very easy, and if you're collecting Hoyas, it is a great way to gain more because you can easily grow them from propagation. It's probably how I've received most of the Hoyas in my collection, through props. Basically all you need is a cut from just below a node ideally, but you can sometimes get a cutting without nodes. I mean, this one does have nodes, but the roots can grow from the stem along there, and that'll be fine. So you can sometimes grow them as nodeless cuttings, but if you're getting a nodeless cutting, be careful. It's not 100% that it will root. It just does in some cases and doesn't in others. It kind of depends on the sort of health of the plant. But I found that they root very, very well in water as well as in soil. So how I do it is I will typically take a cutting, I will put that into water until it grows roots or just starts to root in there. And then from there, I will just put it into soil. Like, they don't need a whole heck of a lot of roots in order to like transfer to soil. You can also just prop Hoyas straight into soil. I've done that with a few of them now and it has been absolutely fine. You just have to make sure that you're watering the soil enough to give that like sort of node time to activate. That's why I prefer doing them in water and then bringing them into the soil, just because it allows those nodes to activate and the roots to like get going a little bit before putting them into their pot. I personally have but dislike propagating Hoyas in sphagnum moss, which is one of my go-tos for things like aroids. Because Hoyas have sort of fine roots, they get really, really, really stuck up in sphagnum moss, and it is a pain to get them out of it once they are rooted really well in it. So it's just better, in my experience, to not propagate them in sphagnum moss. But that being said, you can totally do it. I've heard perlite is another really great option for them, but that is not how I do it. I prefer the sort of water to soil method myself. Okay, let's talk about Hoya flowers for a second, because a lot of people get into Hoyas specifically for their flowers, and they get different varieties of Hoyas, not necessarily for their foliage and leaves, but for their flowers. And every different Hoya has a sort of slightly different flower. I'll pop up some pictures on the screen of all of the Hoya flowers that I have had in my collection. Not all of my Hoyas have flowered. I think only in the last 2 years have I had Hoyas that have flowered, and it is just such a magical thing when you get your first Hoya bloom. It feels so special, especially if you have grown that plant from quite small. I will also say some of the Hoyas are more prolific bloomers than others. Things like the Crimson Princess and Carnosas tend to not bloom as much as things like the Hoya Bella, which is known for being a very, very prolific bloomer. So it really does depend on the type of Hoya as to how easy it is to get to flower. But most of them flower in like these really cool bursts, kind of like a big pom-pom of flowers, and you get this lovely little orb of like little jewelly flowers. Also, Hoyas are known as porcelain flower plants because some of the flowers look like little porcelain pieces, and most of them smell really great. They're usually quite sweet, and they produce these sort of nectar drops on them as well, which, be careful, can drip down and like get your carpet mucky, so just be aware that that is the case. Also, some people find them a little bit sickly. It really depends on the type and how sensitive your nose is, but I find that I really like the smell of my Hoya flowers. The flowers grow from these sort of extra stems here. You can see this one's actually about to bloom. These extra stems that grow off the sort of main stem. This is called a peduncle, and you want to make sure that you don't cut off the peduncles once the plant has flowered, because it will flower from that point again. You can see I kind of have these throughout my plant. The Rosita is a very prolific bloomer in my experience, and surprisingly, it has bloomed both in summer and winter. I've found that most Hoyas will bloom in spring and summertime when it is warmer, but there are a few that do prefer the colder months, like my Hoya retusa. It's currently blooming right now in the winter, and it's quite fun to have some that bloom at different times of year. This one was hugely prolific during the summer months, blooming loads, but like I said, it's got a peduncle right now, and it has given me flowers in the past couple months, which is very odd for it. It has never given me winter blooms previously, but it's decided it wanted to do it this year, and I'm not going to complain because they are really cool looking. If you do want to get your Hoyas to bloom, you want to make sure that they are getting enough light to do so. They do require slightly more light. If you have them in a sort of darker spot or not getting adequate light, they're not as likely to bloom. They still might, but it's sort of less of a chance. You can also, like I said earlier, use a more like blooming fertilizer, high in phosphorus, or try orchid mist, but I've personally not had success with that or even tried it enough for me to like sort of give that any sort of credibility. I just kind of let them bloom on their own. One of the biggest issues I had with my Hoyas was flat mites, and I have a whole video talking about how I was able to get rid of flat mites on my Hoyas, but I think it's important to like mention it in this video at the very least. So if you have found that your Hoyas aren't growing at all, like literally no growth, it is probably worth taking a microscope to them and checking for flat mites. Flat mites are these like very, 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 very tiny, pretty much microscopic, very minimally visible to the human eye. You probably will not notice them unless you really know what to look for and looking super closely, that basically eat any sort of new growth and stunt the plant's growth and stop it from being healthy. This one, my Hoya polyneura, was riddled with them at one point, just like absolutely covered. It was disgusting, and it was not growing at all, and I actually had to treat all of the plants in my whole collection, all of my Hoyas, and all of the rest of the plants because they were starting to spread as well throughout the other plants in my collection. And so I did a huge, massive sulfur treatment on everything, but I'm not going to go into details on that because it's all in that other video. But if you are noticing that your Hoyas just really aren't growing at all, that could be the root of the problem. So it's worth getting something like a magnifying lens for your phone or a USB microscope or something. I'll link the ones I have down below in the description because that's pretty much the only way you're going to find them, and it can be very, very helpful. Since I have gotten rid of the flat mites, I have noticed this one starting to grow again and actually give me new leaves, which is really, really nice, and it makes me glad to know that I have saved her because she is very high up there on my list of favorites. One more amazing thing about Hoyas is that they are non-toxic. They will not cause any issues if your pets, like cats and dogs, or kids end up taking a little nibble to them. It won't cause them harm, so that's awesome. Obviously, if they're ingesting huge amounts of this plant, it's probably not going to be good for them, so avoid that, but a little bite here and there isn't going to cause them any issues, so you don't need to worry about keeping them out of reach, which I think is awesome. It's great for me and Cleo because she's not gonna die if she eats it like she could with a lot of my other plants in my collection. So yeah, that is it. That is how I take care of my Hoyas and keep them happy and healthy and thriving. It's been a process learning all this information, so I'm glad to be able to share it with all of you in one sort of concise video. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up down below and leave a comment on other houseplanty things you'd like me to talk about in the future, and subscribe for more. Also, I highly recommend going to watch my Hoya ranking video if you haven't done so already, because you can see every single one of my Hoyas and hear each of their stories, and it's just generally a great time. So huge thanks again for watching. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I will see you in the next one. Don't forget to keep growing. Bye!